I heard my mother scream before I even opened the front door. Not a scared scream. Not grief either. It sounded like panic, the kind that comes from someone realizing the lie they've protected for years is finally collapsing. I dropped my suitcase in the hallway and rushed toward the kitchen. My mother stood frozen beside the counter, one hand gripping her chest, while my younger sister Emily stared at the floor, pale as paper, and sitting calmly at the dining table was a man I had never seen before. Gray hair, wrinkled denim jacket, thick fingers wrapped around a coffee mug. But the moment I looked into his eyes, something inside me shifted violently, because somehow, he looked exactly like me. Nobody spoke for several seconds, then the man looked directly at me and said quietly, "You have your father's eyes." My mother immediately snapped, "Get out." Her voice cracked so hard it barely sounded human. The man slowly stood up, calm while chaos exploded around him. "I think he deserves the truth, Diane." "No," my mother hissed. "You've done enough, enough." That word stayed lodged in my skull like broken glass. I looked between them. "What truth?" Nobody answered. Emily suddenly grabbed her purse and rushed out the back door crying. And that's when I knew. Whatever this was, my entire family already knew about it except me. I'm Mason Reed, 32 years old. Born and raised in Spokane, Washington. At least that's what I believed. For most of my life, my family looked normal from the outside. Quiet middle-class neighborhood. My mom worked as a nurse. My stepdad Richard owned an auto repair shop. My younger sister Emily taught second grade. Nothing dramatic. Nothing unusual. But when I look back now, I realize my entire childhood was built on carefully arranged silence. Richard never treated me badly. But he never treated me like a son either. He paid for school clothes, showed up to my basketball games, taught me how to drive. Still, there was always distance. Like he was performing responsibility instead of feeling it. When I was 13, I overheard my parents arguing late one night. "You said he'd never come back," Richard whispered harshly. "He wasn't supposed to," my mother replied. I remember lying awake afterward staring at the ceiling, trying to understand who they were talking about. The next morning, everything returned to normal. That became the pattern of my life. Questions appeared, then disappeared. Silence swallowed everything. When I was 16, I found an old photograph hidden inside my mother's closet. It showed her standing beside a tall man with dark hair outside a lake cabin. She looked younger, happier, and pregnant. Written on the back was one sentence. Summer 1993. Before everything changed. No name, no explanation. When I asked her about it, she snatched the photo from my hand so quickly it startled me. "That's nobody," she said coldly. "Nobody." But she burned the photograph in the kitchen sink that same night. I never forgot that. Some part of me always understood our family had a locked door. Nobody wanted me opening. By 25, I stopped asking questions entirely. I moved to Seattle and built a decent life. I worked as a financial analyst downtown. Long hours, good money, quiet apartment overlooking Elliott Bay. I dated here and there but nothing lasted. Every relationship eventually hit the same wall. People would ask about my family. And I never knew how to answer. Because even before learning the truth, I always felt like a guest inside my own life. Then 3 days ago, everything shattered. My mother called me at 6:14 in the morning. "Mason," she said shakily. "Richard had a stroke." I drove 4.5 hours back to Spokane without stopping once. Richard survived. But the stroke left his left side, partially paralyzed. The doctors said recovery would take months. I stayed at the hospital most of the day while my mother handled paperwork. Around evening, Richard motioned for me to lean closer. His speech was slurred. Weak. But I understood every word. "You deserve better than this family," I frowned. "What does that mean?" Tears filled his eyes. But before he could answer, my mother walked back into the room. And Richard immediately went silent. Now here we were. 20 years of secrets sitting at the kitchen table wearing a denim jacket. The strange man finally reached into his pocket and slid an envelope toward me. My mother lunged for it instantly. "No." But I grabbed it first. Inside was a birth certificate, my birth certificate. Except the father's name wasn't Richard Reed. It was Daniel Mercer, the man standing in front of me. I felt the blood drain from my face. "No," I whispered. My mother looked like she might collapse. Daniel spoke softly. "I tried to contact you for years. You're lying, she snapped. I have letters. He pulled several worn envelopes from his jacket pocket, all unopened, all addressed to me. My hands shook as I stared at them. The oldest one was dated 19 years ago. I looked at my mother slowly. You kept these from me? Her silence answered everything. Suddenly my entire childhood rearranged itself inside my head. Richard's distance, the arguments, the missing photos, the strange tension every holiday, none of it was random. I looked back at Daniel. Why now? His expression darkened. Because Richard finally contacted me last week. My mother inhaled sharply. He said if he died before telling you the truth, he couldn't live with himself anymore. I stared at her in disbelief. You knew Richard talked to him? She started crying. Real crying, not graceful tears, ugly panic. I was trying to protect our family. From what? Her voice cracked. From losing you. Daniel laughed quietly then, not mocking, sad. You already lost him years ago. That sentence hit the room like a grenade. I walked outside before anyone could stop me. The cold evening air hit my face hard, but my chest still felt suffocating. I sat in my car for nearly an hour staring at nothing. My entire identity suddenly felt fake. Not altered. Fake. At around midnight, Emily finally texted me. I'm sorry, that was it. I drove to her apartment immediately. When she opened the door, her eyes were swollen from crying. How long did you know? I asked. She looked down. Since I was 15. Something inside me cracked. You let me spend 17 years believing a lie? Emily wiped her face. Mom made me promise. I laughed bitterly. Of course she did. She sat down slowly. Mason. It's worse than you think. I froze. What does that mean? Emily looked terrified to say it, then finally whispered. Mom didn't just hide your father from you. The room suddenly felt smaller. She told Daniel you died. I stared at her. My brain literally stopped processing for a second. What? She told him you died from pneumonia when you were 3. The silence afterward was unbearable. I couldn't breathe properly. Couldn't think. I just kept hearing the same sentence repeating in my head. She told him you died. What kind of person does that? I whispered. Emily started sobbing again. She was scared. No, I snapped. She was cruel. Then came the next knife. Richard knew too. I stood up immediately. No, he found out after they got married. Mom begged him not to leave. So he helped her? Emily nodded slowly. I turned away before I exploded. My entire life, every birthday, every Christmas, every family dinner, built on a horrifying lie. And the worst part? I still didn't know why. The next morning, I went back to my mother's house before sunrise. She looked exhausted sitting alone at the kitchen table. For a moment she didn't look manipulative. She looked old, small, human. But the sympathy vanished the second she spoke. I did what I had to do. I stared at her. You told a man his son was dead. Tears slid down her face again. You don't understand what Daniel was like back then. Then explain it. She stayed silent. I slammed my hand against the table so hard she jumped. For once in your life, stop hiding. Her face hardened slightly. He chose his music over us. I blinked. What? He played bars. Drank constantly, chased stupid dreams while I was pregnant. Daniel had been a musician. She laughed bitterly. We were broke, Mason, completely broke, so you faked my death. You were 2 years old, she whispered desperately. I met Richard. He had stability, a home, insurance, a future. I stared at her in horror. You replaced my father like changing apartments. It wasn't that simple. But it was that selfish. She covered her face. You don't understand survival. No, I said quietly. I understand betrayal. For the first time in my life, my mother looked afraid of me. Good, she should have been. I left and drove straight to Daniel's motel on the edge of town. He opened the door slowly, almost cautiously. Like he expected me to disappear if he moved too fast. Inside the room were photographs spread across the bed, hundreds of them, pictures of me, school photos, basketball games, college graduation. My stomach dropped. How did you get these? Your Aunt Carol, he said softly. Your mother cut contact with her years ago, but Carol secretly sent me updates. I sat down heavily. You knew I was alive this whole time? Not at first. He looked away. For 3 years, I believed you were dead. I felt physically sick hearing it aloud. Then he reached into a drawer and handed me a small stack of folded papers, therapy records, medication prescriptions, psychiatric evaluations. I lost my mind after she told me. My throat tightened. I'm sorry. Daniel gave a weak smile. You don't owe me an apology? He explained everything slowly over the next 2 hours. After my birth, money problems destroyed their relationship. Daniel traveled constantly for gigs while my mother struggled alone. One night after a massive fight, she disappeared with me. 3 weeks later, Daniel received a letter saying, I died from complications during a severe infection. No funeral, no hospital records, nothing. But grief destroyed him too completely to question it at first. By the time he finally started investigating, my mother had vanished completely. Changed cities, changed numbers, changed everything. Richard entered the picture 2 years later. And together, they buried the truth. I wanted to hate Daniel too. Part of me needed someone else to blame, but looking at him, I couldn't. He looked like a man who'd already punished himself for decades. Then he said something that shattered me completely. I came to Spokane once when you were 8. I looked up slowly. What? I saw you at a park with Richard. My chest tightened. I almost walked over. Why didn't you? Tears filled his eyes. Because you looked happy. That destroyed me more than all the lies. Because even after losing everything, he still chose what he thought was best for me. Meanwhile, my mother stole 20 years from both of us. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat alone in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by old memories that suddenly felt contaminated. Around 2 a.m. I started opening drawers, digging matching. And inside an old storage box beneath winter blankets, I found another secret, a stack of letters tied together with blue ribbon, all from Daniel. Every birthday, every Christmas, every year, letters my mother never gave me. I sat on the floor reading until sunrise. Some were simple. Happy 10th birthday, buddy. I hope you still love dinosaurs. Others nearly broke me. I heard you made varsity basketball. I'm proud of you every single day. And one letter stopped my breathing entirely. If you ever read this someday, I need you to know I never abandoned you. Not once. I cried harder than I had in years. Not because I suddenly gained a father, but because I realized how thoroughly I had been robbed. The next week detonated our entire family. Emily stopped speaking to Mom completely. Richard finally admitted everything from his hospital bed. I should told you years ago. Why didn't you? He stared at the ceiling for a long time, because by then, I loved you like my own son. And I knew the truth would make you hate us. I laughed bitterly. You made that happen anyway. The hardest part was realizing Richard genuinely did love me in his own damaged way, which somehow made the betrayal more painful. Then came the twist none of us expected. 3 days later, Aunt Carol visited me privately, and, the moment she closed the apartment door, she said, Your mother isn't telling you the whole story. I felt exhausted already. What now? Carol looked deeply uncomfortable. Daniel wasn't the unstable one. I froze. She was. Apparently my mother had struggled with severe untreated paranoia in her 20s. Obsessive fears, control issues, extreme emotional swings. She became convinced Daniel would leave her eventually. Carol explained quietly, so she left first. But why fake my death? Carol's eyes filled with pity. Because she believed if she couldn't have complete control over the family, nobody could. I sat there stunned. Suddenly so many memories made sense. My mother monitoring my friendships, her constant guilt trips, her explosive reactions whenever people became independent. Even my failed relationships started making sense. I had spent my entire life unconsciously normalizing emotional manipulation. Then Carol handed me something else, an old cassette tape. Daniel recorded this after your mother disappeared. I found an old player at a thrift shop that afternoon just to hear it. The tape hissed softly before Daniel's younger voice filled the room. Diane, if you hear this, please just tell me Mason's alive. I don't care if you hate me. I don't care if you never come back. Just tell me my son is breathing somewhere. Then silence, then crying. Real, uncontrollable crying. I turned the tape off halfway through because I physically couldn't handle it anymore. That evening my mother showed up at my apartment unexpectedly. The moment I opened the door, I knew something was wrong. She looked frantic. Mason, please listen to me. I crossed my arms. You've had 32 years. She stepped inside anyway. You can't trust Daniel. I almost laughed. You really still think this works? He's manipulating you. No, I snapped. That was your job. Her face twisted painfully. I did everything for you. You did everything for yourself. She suddenly grabbed my arm. Hard? You were happy. I pulled away instantly. No, I was controlled. She looked stunned hearing that word. Then her voice dropped almost to a whisper. If you leave me for him after everything I sacrificed. There it was, the truth underneath all her tears. Possession, not love. Possession. You never saw me as a son, I said quietly. You saw me as something you owned. She slapped me, hard enough to turn my head sideways. The silence afterward felt monstrous. Her hand trembled immediately. Mason. But something inside me had finally gone cold. I opened the front door, calmly. You need to leave. She started crying again, real panic this time. Please don't do this. I looked directly at her. You already did. Then I closed the door. For the first time in my life, I chose myself over my mother's guilt. And everything changed after that. The following months were brutal. My mother spiraled quickly once the family stopped protecting her version of reality. Emily moved across the state with her fiancé. Richard filled full separation after his Betrayal. Apparently decades of guilt finally broke him too. Meanwhile, I slowly started building something fragile with Daniel. It wasn't instant. We weren't magically father and son overnight. Some conversations were awkward, some painful. Sometimes we sat in silence not knowing how to recover 30 lost years, but there was honesty. For the first time in my life. Honesty. One afternoon Daniel invited me fishing near Lake Coeur d'Alene. Halfway through the trip he suddenly laughed while untangling a line. You used to hate worms. I looked at him confused then realized. You remember that? You were too. He smiled softly. You cried for 20 minutes because you thought the worms were lonely. I laughed harder than I had in months, and unexpectedly, it hurt. Because those tiny memories should belong to my whole life. Not stolen fragments recovered decades later. Then came the final collapse. Exactly 11 months after the truth came out, my mother was arrested, not for anything involving me. Worse, financial fraud, at the hospital where she worked. Turns out she'd been manipulating medical reimbursement records for years. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. The investigation uncovered nearly $180,000 in falsified claims. When Emily called me crying about the arrest, I felt nothing, no triumph, no rage, just emptiness, because deep down, part of me finally understood something terrifying. People who spend their lives hiding one massive lie, eventually start believing they can hide everything. At the trial, my mother looked smaller than I remembered. Defeated. When the judge asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, she looked directly at me in the gallery. And for one impossible second, I thought maybe she'd finally apologize. Instead she whispered, I only ever wanted my family together. I stared at her in disbelief even now. Even after everything. She still couldn't admit what she'd done. The judge sentenced her to 4 years. As deputies escorted her away, she kept looking back at me like I was abandoning her. But I wasn't abandoning anyone. I was finally escaping. Yesterday marked exactly 20 years since the day my mother told Daniel I was dead. And yesterday, ironically, was also the day the final secret ended, because Daniel handed me a small box during dinner. Inside was a stack of legal documents, adult adoption papers. He looked nervous saying it. You already have my blood, but if you want my name too. I couldn't even speak at first. For 32 years, identity felt like something broken inside me, a missing piece I couldn't explain. But sitting there across from the man who never stopped searching for me, something finally settled. Not perfectly, not magically, but enough. I signed the papers this morning. Mason Mercer. It still feels strange saying it out loud, but for the first time in my life, my name feels honest, and maybe that's the cruelest part of this entire story. The truth didn't destroy me, the lies did.